I'm Beth, I'm with Murdo today, and we're going to be talking about the regulation of privately operated car parks bill today with Murdo. Would you be able to tell us the objectives of the bill?
Sure. I mean, this started because I received so many complaints from members of the public about private car parks, which people felt were overcharging, were penalising people unfairly. And this led me to investigate the law into private car parking in Scotland. And what became clear very quickly was, because the law is not codified in any particular fashion, it's very difficult for people to understand where exactly the law stands, and that allows some unscrupulous car park operators to exploit loopholes in the law and exploit people's confusion, and it ends up in a situation where people are unfairly being charged for breaching unfair rules of car parks. So what my bill really is intended to do is for the first time properly codify the law around private car parking in Scotland, so it's clear to all parties exactly where they stand, and in particular bring into Scotland an independent appeals system. We've had an independent appeal system in England and Wales for some years now, but nothing similar in Scotland, and I felt that bringing that in would be probably the single most useful thing that could be done to try and give greater protection to those who are parking their cars who at the moment feel they're being unfairly treated.
So you say you had many complaints. Was that just your constituents, or was there?
Yes, it was. It started off with one particular car park in Perth, which is the area I represent, operated by one company who they changed the way in which people paid for tickets. So instead of previously just putting money in a machine and getting a ticket, they changed the system whereby people had to enter their registration number and then estimate how much money they had to pay for the time they parked. And this led to a lot of people being caught out, a lot of penalty charge notices being issued, which would very quickly escalate to £160 with threats of court action. And people were very upset by this, were very distressed by it in some cases, and I started to get an awful lot of people writing to me. And then when I started to raise the issue in Parliament, because that created more of a national profile, I then got letters from people in different parts of Scotland who would then write to me asking for my assistance and asking for me to try and do something to address this.
Right, so obviously you're saying there's an issue with the law. Can you say how your bill's going to remedy these issues?
Well, the basic problem with the law is I think there's a lack of clarity.
Yes.
The current law that governs private car parking is the general law of contract. So when you drive into a car park, you are deemed to be entering into a contract with the car park owner, and you agree to meet their reasonable terms and conditions. But there isn't much guidance beyond that in the law, other than some pretty isolated case law saying what the reasonable terms and conditions would be. And what my bill set out to do really was 5 things. Firstly, to bring in an independent appeal system in Scotland to reflect what's happened south of the border. To bring in a system of capping of the level of charges, so car park operators couldn't penalise people unreasonably. It's perfectly fair if somebody breaches a reasonable condition that they have to pay a penalty, but the level that was being charged by some car park operators was unfair, so I wanted to cap that. I wanted to bring something in that was going to improve the signage, so when you enter a private car park it becomes clear very quickly what the terms and conditions are, because there was a lot of confusion around the signage. The 4th provision was to regulate the appearance of penalty charge notices, because at the moment many car park operators make them appear like a parking ticket you would get if you parked on the street, and yet in law they are quite different things. So I wanted to improve that. And the 5th area was to bring in what's called keeper liability, which currently exists in England and Wales, but not in Scotland, to make it clear who is liable for payment of charge notices. Because at the moment, again, that's an area of some confusion in the law in Scotland.
So I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Ninewells Hospital they started a petition about car parks. So is this a bill they can rely on to solve their issue?
Well, I think there's probably a conflation of 2 separate issues there. Most hospitals in Scotland have free car parking. I think there are 3 hospitals which still have parking that's charged for. Ninewells Hospital being one, which is a historic arrangement which in relation to a long-term contract that NHS Tayside entered into with a car park provider, which cannot now be removed without penalty, a major penalty to the NHS. So I think there are some people who object to paying at all for hospital parking, and that's not something this bill would address. But what this bill would address would be a situation where somebody breaches the conditions of the car park. For example, they don't pay enough money for their stay, and they're then hit with a penalty notice from the car park operator. And what this bill would do is perhaps make it clearer in what circumstances people do have to pay that penalty, and also make sure that the level of that penalty is not excessive. And at the moment, a lot of the complaints we get is about excessive penalty charges.
So, how is your bill at the minute being received in Parliament here?
Well, there's been a very strong cross-party support for the bill. We've had a number of debates over the years on the issue of private car parking. I initiated a members' debate, I think it was about 3 years ago, on this issue, where we had strong cross-party support for a change in the law. And at that time, the Scottish Government had set up a forum bringing together consumer groups like Citizens Advice Scotland and representatives of the car parking industry to try and discuss a way forward. But the forum had made very, very slow progress. It was very difficult for the government to get any unanimity on what was going to be done. And I said it was about time that legislation was brought in to address this, because a voluntary approach wasn't working. And what's now happened is we've had cross-party support. We've had an indication from the former Transport Minister, Hamza Yousaf, that the Scottish Government does support the objectives of my bill. We've now seen two new developments which are affecting what's happening. One is that in the UK Parliament, a Conservative MP called Greg Knight has introduced his own private member's bill on improving the regulation of private car parking. Some of that will apply to Scotland, so that will help address some of the issues I've raised. But there will still be areas that are not covered, and I've been in discussion with the Scottish Government about using the transport bill that is currently before the Scottish Government as a vehicle to try and address the remaining issues. And that's currently with the Scottish Government's lawyers. The bill as drafted doesn't address the issue of charging for private car parks. It does address other issues around parking, such as parking on pavements and double parking of vehicles. So I would be optimistic that what I'm trying to propose would be within the scope of that bill. And if it is possible for either for myself or for the Scottish Government to bring forward amendments at stage 2 of the bill to try and address these issues, that would be a way of getting the necessary legislation through without me having to go through the whole process of completing a member's bill, which can be very laborious and time consuming. And if there's another easier way of doing it, then I'm very happy to go down that route.
Would you say there's been any opposition to the bill in terms of the companies or like other politicians or parties?
There's been no political opposition to it. There's been very strong cross-party support. It's been quite interesting because I've had very good contact with representatives of the car parking industry, particularly the British Parking Association, who are the largest representative body, and they have been very supportive from the start of the bill, because they understand that the law, at the moment being unclear, actually is not to the benefit of their members. If you look at the number of penalty charge notices which are issued in Scotland, only, according to the latest figures, about 20 to 25% of those are actually paid. So the car park companies are themselves losing out on a substantial revenue stream because of the uncertainty around the law, and a lot of the public think these notices are unenforceable, so they simply ignore them. And I think changing the law would not just be a good thing from the point of view of people parking their cars, but actually it would be a good thing from the point of view of the car park companies themselves, because with greater certainty around the law, they would then be able to recover more of the penalties than the very small proportion that they're currently recovering. So overall, it has very broad support. It has support from consumer groups like Citizens Advice Scotland and representatives of motorists, but it also has support from the car parking industry.
And how long is this bill expected to stay in Parliament?
Well, I suppose that's a matter that's still under discussion. The transport bill was introduced to Parliament, I think, in around September time, and is currently going through its process of parliamentary scrutiny, and that is likely to complete its parliamentary scrutiny and its parliamentary passage by June next year. So if the government, we can get the government to agree to use the transport bill as a vehicle for addressing this, that should be on the statute book by the middle of next year, probably with an introduction date, I would expect, in early 2020. So perhaps a year from now. If we can't do that, and I have to go back to bringing in a separate members bill, that potentially could take much longer, but I would hope we could get that done by the end of 2020 at the latest.
Thank you very much for having us.